Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for this reseller drop-in session. I hope it's finding you well. Obviously, we're still in challenging times, so I hope businesses, families, all good. The more observant of you may have noticed that we're at a new home, actually where we started out, YouTube Live. It just seems like the best place for us, I think, in terms of usability and the kind of sessions we run. So I think this is going to be where we're going to stay from now on. So, get used to get used to YouTube being the place to come for these sessions. This should be a good one. It's quite a technical session. Before I get into it, if you've got any feedback in terms of how we promote these, the content we're talking about, anything to do with how we structure them, please let me know. This is going to be one of the more technical sessions focused on optimization and system health and that kind of thing, which is why I've brought in two friends who know far more about this sort of thing than I do, and it's probably a good time to introduce them actually. So I've got Rebecca here from MailStore and Neil from Zen Software, our distributor in the UK. You right over there, guys?
Yeah, hello.
Hi there, everyone. Neil here.
Hi, Neil.
Rebecca, hi.
So, probably at this point, I should just check in the chat to make sure. Can everyone hear us okay? Is it all working all right? There's a fair bit going on behind the scenes to make this happen, so hopefully you can let us know in the chat whether you can hear us, see us okay. Damien, thank you for that one. Much appreciated. I should point out, by the way, I'll be manning the chat. On the whole, so I'll pick up your questions. You're welcome to ask them throughout. This should be quite an informal, relaxed session, and Neil's probably going to help me with those as well. So between us, we'll cover them all off.
Yeah, sure, ready.
Yeah, good man. So I don't normally do an agenda, but I thought it's probably worthwhile for this one, as it's a bit of a sort of comprehensive technical one. I'm going to start off just having a quick look at the kind of questions you need to ask your customers. So before you dive into how best to set up MailStore for new customers, or even for your existing clients, how to have the configuration optimized, these are the questions that you should be thinking about asking. We'll then have a look at the strategy. So we'll talk about things like journaling versus mailbox collection. Then we'll look at the flexibility that MailStore offers in terms of where you can put your data and what that allows you to do when you're working with different types of hardware. Then there's a topic around the scheduling of jobs. So this is quite a big area actually, and that has quite a big impact on performance. So we'll cover that in a bit of depth. And then we're going to finish up with some sort of miscellaneous points that might affect performance. So we're aiming for it should be hopefully about 30 minutes content. That's the plan, and then we've got as long as you like for questions, as always. I'm just checking the chat. Yeah, Phil, nice to see you. And excellent. Next Generation with us as well. Brilliant, good stuff. So straight into the questions you should be asking. So to begin with, to understand what it is that's going to feed the stuff that Rebecca and Neil will be talking about, we first of all need to understand how is a customer going to use MailStore. The user features are something that we always want to be selling. They're a fantastic part of MailStore, but you can't get away from the fact that sometimes customers aren't going to use that. They might think of archiving just like a backup solution essentially. So it's just taking copies and that's there for the admin to access when needed. So you need to have that conversation. Are they going to use the archiving features? Are they going to be searching? Are they going to need to browse folders? It's normally quite a big deal if you're used to working with folders. Are they going to be browsing those? MailStore can also adjust the level of mail in a mailbox, and of course that can significantly speed up Outlook. So you need to have a conversation around, look, we're archiving everything. It's all available in the search and through browse. How much can we limit how much can we set your mailbox retention to? It could be 3, 6, 12 months. So you need to have a conversation around, what do they expect to actually be in the mailbox on the basis that they can still find everything via the search anyway. Talk to them about folder numbers, how they use them. If they've got loads and loads of nested folders, that will have some sort of impact. Are they going to be searching continuously throughout the day, or is it more of a kind of a, HR team checking, occasionally for threads? And understand the mail that they're working with. So you've got historic mail that may not have such a great impact as, say, the daily volume of email. And that's really critical, is how much email is coming in, on a daily basis, and that's what's going to have probably the most impact over how much they're coming to the solution with, how much you've got to bring in historically. And also things like message size. So if you've got a construction company or lots of technical drawings, or understand, is it lots of small messages or is it larger messages perhaps? And all that information will help you understand what it is you need to build in terms of the solution and how to structure it. This is a quick at a glance checklist that covers those points I've just mentioned. I've added 2 more on the bottom there. Probably one of the first questions you're going to ask actually is number of users. So if it's a 5-user installation, maybe you don't need to spend that much time on these kind of topics. But of course, MailStore supports up to 500 users, so anything in between. Understand how many users they have and how many are active versus maybe inactive, people that have left the company, that you still want access to their mailboxes. And then understand what you're working with in terms of hardware. I'm sure you're more than used to doing that, understanding what they've got there as a platform, but are you going to have to share a piece of hardware, or is it going to be the case that they can spend a reasonable amount on the right hardware for the kit? Once you have that information, that's where we can start to then build a strategy. So hopefully Rebecca is going to elaborate on this a bit more for me. So if that's all right, Rebecca, I'll hand over to you. You can have a little chat about that.
Thank you, Neil. Yes,
James?
The first interesting question you would then have is actually which strategy you want to choose. You, on the one hand, you have the journal archiving, and on the other hand, you have mailbox archiving. Those are 2 different strategies. And where journal archiving actually means, journaling is actually the name is what Microsoft Exchange calls it, and Microsoft 365 for many other server systems also offer a very similar approach, where you can actually capture a copy of each mail that is either sent in, so delivered to a user, or sent out from a user. So you're actually getting a valid copy of each mail that is being sent or received. And when you archive that, you mainly have one archiving source, and this will not consume too much resources for your MailStore server, because yes, it's focusing on one central source and actually archiving from it. With this strategy, you actually can fulfill compliance situations, like saying your archive needs to be complete and you need to make sure to capture every mail and not just most of them. But actually, on the other side, there's also mailbox archiving, where MailStore server actually monitors over and over again what's happening in the user mailboxes. Mailbox archiving actually also enables you to actually go through the mailboxes over and over again to replay the situation in the mailboxes. So in the archive, you'll also have the folder structure of mailboxes when you archive from them. So when your users are actually using the archiving solution and actually doing research and browsing in it on a daily routine, then it might be helpful for many users that tend to actually sort their mailboxes and design it with subfolders and have a structure in there, that they also find this structure in their archive. And also, only when MailStore server is actually touching mailboxes and going through them over and over again, it has a chance to actually apply rules. Like you have retention ideas, like saying, I want to keep the mailboxes smaller, I want to keep them cleaner, I want to delete everything that's older than 6 months, a year, whatever rule you set up. This can happen when you actually archive mailboxes. And MailStore server also allows to combine both methods. And the going through all mailboxes over and over again takes some more resources, because MailStore server is monitoring the mailboxes. They will not be emptied. There will be a lot of same content over and over again. So MailStore server is going through and comparing, do I have that mail? Do I still need that mail? So that's a little more effort. And I will just switch over to a screen. If you can help me, James.
There you go,
James. In our Reseller server help, we actually have a nice calculator which our engineers designed, so you can actually estimate how much resources you will be needing in the future. And this calculator has, besides, of course, general sliders like what amount of users do you have at all, how many users do you want to archive, and then primary archiving source. This is really what we're just talking about. This is journal archiving, so just monitoring in and outgoing mail, or is it actually a combination or just user mailboxes? Because that strategy might need different resources. This might need more CPU power, for example. When I put this a little high, you see really some differences here. So it's very interesting to actually use the calculator to get a rough idea what this machine should look like in the future. Well, thank you. I'll just pass it back then.
Okay, fantastic.
I'll step in there.
Go on.
The system requirements calculator is really the first point of calls for any installation. Before we'll go on to talk about the actual bit more details about things like the disk access, but understanding the sort of base level requirements is key. Our experience tends to be that for those smaller installations, the requirements are probably a little bit less than what the calculator comes up with, but it's definitely a really good starting point. You're not going to go wrong if you start there.
Fantastic. And I was just checking the quality. We had a couple of quality issues there, but I think we're all good now, everyone. It sounds like that's okay. So Rebecca, I think you're all right to continue. I'll keep an eye on the chat just to make sure that's not going to persist. We had some doubling of audio, but I think we're all right now.
Okay. Yes. So shall we just continue with the next idea? Because the question then is, of course, where will your data be stored actually? Where are you putting your data? What's happening in the background? And I'd like to switch to my actual screen again.
Okay.
That's okay for you, James?
That's looking good.
So I already have MailStore Server installed here. I'm just having a look at the file system just to see what's going on there, because MailStore Server is actually using database technology. So it is not just storing each mail as a single plain mail file on the file system, but actually using database technology. And the database stores data chunk files on the file system, and these files are also encrypted, so they cannot be read by any external program. They don't make any sense and cannot be manipulated. So this is also a security issue. By default, when MailStore Server is installed, it actually creates C mail archive here, and inside of this you see a few files, and MailStore Server actually keeps things a little separate from each other. There's a master database which actually contains all your settings, so everything you set up inside of MailStore Server. And separate from that, there's, for example, here's the first archive store that has been created. And this one contains a main, just ignore these log and key files. The key file is for security reasons. Log file just means it's opened right now, it's active. This FDB file actually here is representing the table, the main information of this archive store, so where is which data found. And in the content folder you actually have, well, just click through, .dat files, which are container files. This is not each .dat file is a mail, but each .dat file is a composition of mail parts, and the table actually knows where which parts are spread over these files. I'm just going a little back. And in this index folder, you have a search index, which is a completely separate database technology that helps for quick searching, for actually having all sorts of keywords to find mails. And this is rather very dry theory, so I'll just switch to the MailStore client. I'm logged in here to MailStore Server as an administrative user. And as you can see right here, I have all sorts of settings, what kind of users I have, which might be more interesting to you as soon as you have it actually installed. But there's one point that actually says storage locations. And here you actually find this information again, where it actually here says, see, mail archive is the location of the master database. That's what I just showed you. MailStore master FTB, for example, these files are located here. And there was one archive store. This is actually this here. And the magic trick is that MailStore server can have more than just one archive store. The users will always see just one sum of archive. It's one big archive. The users won't see what's happening in the background here, but you can have multiple archive stores, mainly for performance reasons and for positioning it on different drives, for example. You can have multiple archive stores. One is always active, so this is the one that is being constantly filled at the moment with new mails, and there can be more than just one. You even have a rule already installed, already created when you install it, but you can also modify this rule. Like you can say, what happens when this, when will this archive store be full, and when will the next one be created? We have a first default example, which would be 5 million mails. This is like a magic break-even point where we usually recommend starting the next archive store. And you can also set it to yearly, for example, if there's a special reason you need them kept separate for each year, for example. Quarterly and monthly is not that recommended because they might be too small and too many of them later. Here you can actually also just set up the location for the next one. Let's say you don't want all archive stores to be stored on one drive because the first one already got 1 terabyte big, for example, and the next one you're expecting it to be 1 terabyte again, and you don't want drives or virtual drives to be a lot of terabytes big. You can also choose to just switch the next archive store to be on the D drive, E drive, whatever. You can also, so this enables you to actually spread your archive stores over multiple drives. And you can also split archive stores into different subfolders and different locations, because the .dat files I just showed you, so the actual container files where all these mail parts are in, are just being used when new mails are archived and written to it, or when the user actually opens up a mail. So actually previews it or downloads it, exports it, whatever. So only when it is needed. So when drive costs actually are very important to you, let's say conventional hard drives, rotating hard drives are much less expensive than solid state drives, for example. Then you have a good chance to actually split this up, especially when you're renting a server at a provider, for example. You have actually the chance to say, okay, I'll order some SSD, fast SSD storage, and also bigger conventional storage that is not that fast. And then you can actually split this up. Things that are being constantly used is, for example, the search index. As soon as a user start searching every day, day over day, then the search index is being used over and over again. And also, of course, the table that should know where each mail part is found is also being used over and over again. So you can actually set this index directory and the database directory on fast SSD drives, and the content directory, which is only being used when it actually needs to be read or written to, can be on conventional drives. So you can actually split this up, and you can detach archive stores. Let's say you have the 11th year, you don't want it anymore, but you still want to back up it somewhere or whatever. You can detach it. You can attach an archive store that comes, for example, from another MailStore server. Like, let's say you had 2 MailStore servers and now you want to merge them into one. Then you can actually detach the archive store from the other MailStore server and attach it here. So you have a complete sum of both of them, both contents. Yeah, so you have a lot of chances to spread your data and have performance. Yes.
One thing we get asked a lot, and we help customers through, is moving archives. And something that I think a lot of people aren't aware of is that the master database doesn't have to be in the same location as the archive store. So what you've just mentioned there about attaching stores from different locations. often customers may start with it in the default location on the C drive, and it's worth, I think, mentioning that it's very easy in MailStore to stop the service, move things to where they need to be. Typically, you might just move it all to, say, a D drive, and then reattach it. Do you just want to just quickly show the configuration tool, just to show where that setting is? You know, the MailStore server configuration.
Oh, well, yes. Wait a second.
Because that's the only thing that's I think our customers tend to forget that tool's there, so it's easy to miss.
Yes, the MailStore server master database can only be moved when the service is disabled, so stopped actually, because it's always active as soon as MailStore server runs. So here you have configure the MailStore server. It will be in your program start menu group, of course, and also on your desktop by default. And here you can actually change this location. So you'd actually stop the servers, change the location, move the actual files there, and then start the service again. And it will just come up from that location when there is a master database. Actually, when you want to keep the master database where it actually is, and you just want to move archive stores, you could also just detach or disable them, move the location on in your file system, change the path here, and just reactivate it or reattach it. And then MailStore server will try to read from that location and see, oh, there's an archive store. I'll just bring it up again, and there it's back.
This is all particularly relevant, isn't it, when you're talking about public cloud providers, for example, where you've got to pay for different types of storage. Having the ability to put the different components on the different access speeds or guaranteed access speeds of certain media is really helpful.
Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, it does. It does make a big difference to cost. I mean, the large space is all in the content, and like Rebecca mentioned, that's not being accessed an awful lot of the time. So it's not really benefiting from being on an SSD. But if you've got potentially terabytes of storage requirements, you can really save a lot of money by putting that on hard drive based technology within the cloud server. Mm-hmm. It's the indexes and the database that's really the intensive part of the archive store. So yeah, if you can split it all up like that, then it does make a big difference.
Yeah. And yes, also you have just to put a very small note on that. Actually, since this is database technology, it also means that each mail that is should be archived to the database, so written to the database, is actually compared to the contents that are already in the database. So technically, this just means MailStore server is creating pointers where the parts are. And when a new mail comes in, and I'll just pick a quick example. You have a mail that has been sent to a user, and there has been a carbon copy to 3 other users, for example. It's basically 4 times the same mail, and it doesn't need to be written 4 times to the database because the contents are actually the same. So there will only be pointers to the data parts, and it only consumes space 1 time. So the databases are actually deduplicating. So this is like, for example, when you start archiving and bring historical data into your MailStore server. I'll just pick a quick example. You have an Exchange server with 1 terabyte of data currently, and you're just doing a one-time archiving to have all that historic data in MailStore server. MailStore server will most certainly only have, like, I don't know, 300, 400, 500 gigabytes, not a terabyte anymore, because any mail that has some duplicate information, even if it's just the attachments or something similar, it will be deduplicated. But of course,
that then, lot with customers that they're surprised how much smaller the same data that's moved from Exchange is when it's in MailStore, and you're really comparing the number of messages as proof that it's all imported. But yes, it's worth noting it can be in certain circumstances significantly less, maybe even a quarter of the size, especially if, like you say, people are used to sending lots of the same message to lots of internal recipients.
Yeah, and also the point is now that we see that it can result in a much smaller data consumption, you also have to, of course, have a look at the fact that you might be archiving for about, 10, 11 years. So this will, of course, be a lot of data you might not have created and kept in a current mail server. So of course, it will still become large, but only as large as really necessary.
Fantastic. I think that's pretty useful stuff. I think you covered that really well. Is there anything else you wanted to cover? Has anyone else got any questions at this stage in the chat? I'll just pause it for a second there and see if anyone... are you guys following that okay? I know some of this stuff, obviously, you'll be familiar with, so we're just trying to make sure we give you something extra beyond what you may know already if you've just installed this and maybe whistled through a setup. So hopefully it's useful. The next section definitely will be, which is the job scheduling. I'll just check to make sure. Feel free to take a pause. There's quite a lot to cover there. I'm going to grab one too.
I'll just copy.
Okay, no questions there then. So on to the job scheduling then, Rebecca.
Yes, I just prepared a very brief installation. It's actually just installed it yesterday, just to show some examples. Here I have profiles already set up. This is actually telling MailStore server what should be archived. Profiles are kind of presets that actually tell MailStore server what to do. And I have 3 different examples here. The first one is journal archiving. So this is actually the method I talked about the first situation. And the second one is actually archiving mailboxes. And this is one single profile, for example. When your server allows a service user, a deputy user kind of, to be allowed to access all mailboxes, then you can actually use this deputy user to fetch all mailboxes. So you have one profile, one user login, but this user can actually be used over and over again to log in all the mail accounts. And then you have really one profile handling all your mailboxes. The alternative would be, when your server doesn't allow that, to actually set up an archiving profile for each mailbox you want to handle. In my case, I think it's 7 or 8 test users. So I would need 7 or 8 of these profiles here to each handle one mailbox. And the interesting thing now is, now I told MailStore server what to do, but also MailStore server needs to know when to do it and how often to do it. And there are 2 different approaches how to automate archiving. The first very handy and very quick solution would be I just right-clicked on it and I say automatic. And here I can actually set up a wait time before executing. So this basically means when the profile runs and it finishes, it waits this amount of seconds and then runs again. This can be very helpful when I definitely know I want to run a profile very often. Like in this example, the journaling profile, I want to have it running every 5 minutes, so 300 seconds makes up 5 minutes in this example. I can do this, but I'll just do it this way. Okay, but let's say I have like 10, or let's say you have 100 users. You have 100 single mailbox profiles. When you actually set up 100 profiles to run every 5 minutes, to rerun every 5 minutes, the problem actually is you have no idea how many profiles will be running at the same time, because you can start them all at the same time, but you never know which one is going to finish when. And then it counts to 300 and runs again. So sometimes there is a big gap between the profiles running, and it can also happen that all profiles run at the same time, and you don't really want that, because MailStore server can actually do multitasking, of course, but each archiving behavior here, each single profile is actually one task that would consume one CPU core. And when you have like 100 profiles running, you'd need 100 CPU cores to have this perfectly fluent.
Rebecca, one thing that we've noticed with customers on that front, especially, is that if you do have even a handful of single mailbox jobs running, over time they'll drift apart. One will finish earlier than another, and within an hour or two, then you'll find that they're kind of interleaving somewhat. But what always happens is if that server restarts, at the point that it restarts and the MailStore service starts again, they all kick in again. And this is usually reported to us as a sudden slowdown of the server. You often find, at that point as an admin, you're trying to log into the server and it's very busy. And it feels like there's a problem. So it's one of the first things I always check is, don't run too many individual mailbox jobs, which I think is what you're going to lead into anyway with the different methods of running them. But what you mentioned before about having a multi-user mailbox job is definitely, I recommend using them wherever possible. Single mailbox jobs are great for focusing in on particular users, but it can be tempting to just create them over and over again. Not to mention every single every one of those jobs needs a unique password, and often users change passwords. So it's better from a design point of view as well to run it under one single account.
Yeah. I'll just go into properties of this multi-mailbox profile, because here I have like a deputy user that is allowed to access all mailboxes, and I'm using that to let MailStore server automatically log into all these mailboxes after another. And here I have a little more control. I can actually say how many archiving jobs do I want to run, do I want to allow at the same time. Here I'm saying, for example, 5, which means when I have 100 100 mailboxes actually to archive, there will never be more than 5 at the same time. So it'll just go through these 5, and whenever one is finished, the slot is open for the next one, but there will never be more than 5 concurrent tasks running. So this gives me a lot more control. But anyway, let's just say I have a scenario where I just need more than one profile. Well, I need a lot of profiles. What else I can do is actually, I have another area here, management API jobs. Jobs are doing something a little differently. Jobs actually start profiles, for example, or a lot of other tasks, of course, also. But I'll just show the profile view right here. I'll just create a job, and I'm telling the job what am I actually going for, and I'm saying I want to start some profile, I want to start some archiving profile, and I can choose from the list of the profiles I actually have, let's say the multi-mailbox, for example, and then I can actually set up a specific time, because let's say you are archiving user mailboxes and you're also using journaling. With journaling, you can make sure you have all mails archived, so you won't miss anything. But maybe your users are organizing their mailboxes and they intentionally delete something because they don't want to see it in there anymore. So it doesn't make sense to run over the mailboxes every 5 minutes and consume all the resources you might come up with. Maybe just doing this nightly would make much more sense. Just an example, of course, when your company works at night and takes a rest at day, it would be the other way around. But actually doing this when there's not much business going on, you can actually say run multi-mailbox profiles or single profiles at night and at a very specific time. Then you're actually controlling when it starts, and not just how many times and how often. You actually say when. And when you have a lot of single profiles, you can also say set up a job for each profile and say the first one starts at 2 o'clock at night, the next one 2:30, and the next one at 3. So you actually get much more control when exactly are they going to start, and will there be a lot of overlapping or not.
This is very important, especially when you're using cloud services. So if you're archiving an Office 365 server, the impact on your bandwidth from wherever the MailStore server is much greater if you're repeatedly archiving the same mailboxes over and over again every 10-15 minutes. That's very little gain as far as users' mailbox archives are updated sooner, but the impact on the bandwidth is huge. And we found that a lot of our MailStore customers using Office 365 by reducing that mailbox, multiple mailbox jobs to daily is usually enough, to be honest, but in some cases hourly rather than every 5 minutes like it was in an automatic mode. It's made a huge difference to the amount of bandwidth it's used. And especially if your MailStore server is also in the cloud, you can often be charged for that bandwidth. So it's something that's worth keeping a close eye on. journaling wherever possible is a lot less intensive on resources, including bandwidth. So it does make a big difference, this.
Yep. Yeah, and also you have an area here where you can actually look at recent results. This actually, yeah, you see, I had this Exchange journaling job running for a lot of times already, and here you can actually see when a certain activity started and ended. So whenever you completely lost the overview, what's happening there, you can actually have a look at the results and see, well, how many things did start and complete, and so obviously ran at the same time. Besides the Windows Task Manager, which just tells you how busy the CPUs are. And well, basically, you can see it this way. Each mailbox you're archiving is a single thread that a CPU core has to process. So when you have like 15 or 10 or 100 tasks running at the same time, in theory, you'd need 100 CPU cores to handle 100 mailbox archiving profiles at the same time. Of course, CPU core can still do multitasking. You might remember older times when you had Windows 95 and of course just one CPU with one core. You still could do multitasking, but that actually means time splitting the CPU core. So it needs to do many things and just pausing the rest, like do a part of this, pause, do a part of that, pause, jump back and do a part of this. So this will of course slow down a little bit, and you still need some headroom to actually allow users to search and to actually request mails and preview them. This is also activity. So a CPU core per task is maybe a little bit too much, but at least half the amount of CPU cores compared to the amount of tasks you will have running at the same time should really be important. So the more you can narrow it down and plan it and put it in jobs to have less things running at the same time, the less CPU cores you actually need to assign to this MailStore server.
We often get admins asking us as well, looking at that slightly differently. Their MailStore server is kind of running too well, and it's utilizing all resources because it's busy archiving, and it's also dealing, search requests. And that if that MailStore server is being shared with other tasks, if it's not a dedicated server, they often say, the CPU usage on MailStore service is high, it's really high, and the memory usage is extremely high. Often this is why. It's because they've got lots of jobs going on, and they really don't necessarily need to be running so many tasks. So it's always a balancing act between getting the most performance out of MailStore and getting your archive jobs to run as quickly as possible versus how much resources that takes up. Often, like you mentioned before, not only archiving a mailbox daily, users won't necessarily see a big change there. As long as their folder structure is recent, the fact that it's not updated for every few minutes when they've moved the messages around isn't noticeable. So it's a balancing act, but yeah, understanding your jobs and how to structure them can make a real big difference to how much how quick a MailStore server feels.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yes.
So I can see we're a little tight on time. So I know there was another topic you wanted to cover, which was the sort of miscellaneous items. Obviously, we can delve into any of these points afterwards, by all means. So some of the other things that can affect MailStore performance.
Yes, I can keep this quite short, but they're very interesting situations because, first of all, as I mentioned, I'm just going to jump back to that. You see, for example, we have a C mail archive folder where everything is in it. Of course, when you spread your archive stores over the system, you might also want to have a look at these. As I said, these files are encrypted. So for any other application external outside of MailStore server, the content of these files doesn't make any sense at all. So usually most of you might be interested in installing a security antivirus solution on your server machine. And you should be aware that security solutions usually have an on-access scanner that actually checks each access to files, also for potential threats. And this means while MailStore server is opening and reading and writing to all these files all the time, the on-access scanner is actually monitoring that, preventing that for a very tiny amount of time, checking whether that request is valid, or is there any, could this be some security issue or not? So this could really be slowing down the actual access to these files from MailStore server. And since they are encrypted and unreadable for your AV solution, it doesn't make sense to scan them, because the AV solution will always notice, well, I don't know what to do. Let's just keep going, for example, or even prevent it because it doesn't make sense. So it's really important to actually exclude these areas where these encrypted MailStore database files are stored. The data inside, even if there was any malicious email, will not be opened inside of a database. It will just be extracted in case you want to read it, you want to do anything with it, it will be extracted. And in that case, this would be, for example, it would be C Windows temp MailStore. This would actually be the area where MailStore server temporarily extracts mails, so they can actually be delivered, opened, or whatever you want to do with them. Of course, monitoring that area makes sense to be absolutely sure with your AV solution, because that are actually real email files, and they could be executed by an external program, but not the encrypted files itself for the database. Those should also always be
excluded.
Excluded. Thank you, excluded, because that would just slow down MailStore server and all the access operations.
I mean, as well as slowing down, we've definitely seen issues where data gets corrupted when an AV tool decides, it's going to remove a DAT file because it thinks it's a threat, and that part of the database gets damaged. So it really is very important to exclude it.
Or it finds it suspicious and just actually prevents writing changes to that file. So then you have a corrupted database because data is never written. It just got lost. So yeah, that's a really important scenario. So always make sure to exclude these special folders. Not everything, just these archive store areas where there's just encrypted data that can't be read and won't be executed. On the other hand, also, you might want to have a look at, you could have a very dedicated MailStore server. So this is a server machine, you set this up and only install MailStore server, and you fully know whatever resources are being used. This can only be MailStore server because there's nothing else on it. There's also scenarios where customers share this machine with other services like file sharing, database servers, an Exchange server. So having MailStore server on the same machine where you have an Exchange server, for example, then you also have to be aware that there are different services all needing resources and they're sharing it. So whenever multiple systems spring into action and get a lot of work to do at the same time, you might be running out of resources. For example, you're archiving from an Exchange server, all mailboxes. You are triggering the Exchange server to read from its database to deliver these mails, and the same MailStore server on the same machine is archiving and reading and indexing at the same time. So there are two systems boosting up at the same time. And also a very...
Would you suggest that that's a good reason to have dedicated hard drives or SSD for MailStore, so that the system can be reading from one drive from Exchange and writing to the database on another one? Would that help in that scenario?
It would, of course. It would help when you just focusing on the drive situation, of course, but also you have the situation like they're sharing CPU, they're sharing bandwidth, whatever, they're sharing all the system at that point. And another situation that you might want to have a look at is MailStore server can also be virtualized. MailStore server generally doesn't really care whether it is installed on a physical machine with the Windows system or if it's a virtual machine. Wherever Windows runs on and is happy on, MailStore server can be installed. It doesn't make a difference. But you have to be aware that, let's say you have hypervisors or a machine that actually provides virtual machines that has like 10 CPUs cores and some amount of RAM, and you put 10 different virtualized machines on it. And each machine has like 4 CPU cores. So you're actually assigning more CPU cores that you physically have. Then you have to consider that MailStore server might have enough CPU cores, but they're already busy in the background doing something for other machines. So, and this also means often hypervisors have only a few drives, for example, and on these drives there are virtual drives created for the different machines. And so there are many virtual machines sharing a physical drive. So when 2 machines are already writing and reading a lot from a disk, the MailStore server seems to be not doing anything to a drive, but the drive is already busy in the background. So sharing resources is also something to put into consideration.
No, when we've spoken in the past, you've recommended using like a disk monitoring tool like Crystal Disk Mark or a similar tool, just to get a real feel for how busy a drive is at that point in time. And I think you're correct there that often a quiet drive isn't actually capable of delivering the performance that you're expecting. So it's definitely worth investigating what actual throughput you've got in the back-end system, and not just assume that it's running at full capacity. It can make a big difference on on how quick you can archive.
Yeah, Crystal Disk Mark is just an example where you can actually benchmark the drive inside the machine just to see, I need an indicator what throughput actually my drive can offer in a certain time. So you have a rough idea. So is this drive really performing, or is it just not doing anything in this machine, but very busy, but triggered by others? So this is just an indicator, just to give you an idea. So how's this disk reacting inside of the machine? And also drive speed also depends on where actually the data is stored. It can be physical drives attached to the server machine or the hypervisor. It can be network attached storage, and there's also many times there's this interesting question: can I put the data on a NAS? And a NAS can be so many different things. It can be a data center where you actually have a dedicated server with very high-speed drives and a dedicated network connection just to this NAS for data transmission, and your server has another network connection to the clients to actually communicate with them. Then, of course, your NAS will be very fast and very responsive and just react like physically attached drives to the same machine. But also a NAS could be, let's say, a USB thumb drive attached to your internet provider's router that offers some NAS functionality. And then this is, of course, limited by the speed that drive can do over USB, and you're sharing the network with all the clients and all the communications. So all this back and forth writing of MailStore server database files is happening over that network, where already all the other clients are communicating with MailStore server, maybe with your mail server, with the internet, sharing files. So this is a mixed environment where it will always slow each other down, all the services and all the communication.
I think that's one of those sessions where we could probably book another webinar just for NAS, NAS, the pros and cons of NAS and what the pitfalls. I'm just very conscious of the time at the moment. I can see a couple of questions coming in. Was there any other last points you want to make in that section, or shall I turn it over to the...
I can just finish it up with a very general thing.
Yeah.
What we always do when we don't have a real direct clue what's happening, so we just see, there's a lot of business and the machine is kind of laggy and we don't know why. It's really just interesting. Windows actually comes with the Windows event viewer. You can actually have a look at the Windows event logs. It always logs its activity, and you can have very interesting is always these areas where in Windows event logs, system and application, where it actually shows whether applications are crashing, whether network drivers are failing all the time and need to reset, and drive issues, etc. Windows will actually log that, and this will always give a good indication where to have a closer look when it's not that obvious. So, well.
Yeah, that's a really good point for troubleshooting, isn't it? Definitely. Okay, so surprise, surprise, we've run slightly over. You'll be shocked and stunned to see. So that was the main body of the content we wanted to share with you. Anyway, that was the tips and things. So I just, as I said in the opening part, we are available we can chat some more. I think, are you okay for time, Neil? Are you right there?
Yeah, fine here. Yeah, I noticed we did have a couple of questions. There's one thing, it's one point that always with these things that I think of halfway through. Just while we're waiting for people to put questions down if they have any. The indexes, Rebecca, you mentioned the indexes early on. Would you mind just bringing up the window that shows the user indexes? Actually, within MailStore. Within MailStore.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't actually show that. Sure, yes.
But
yes,
just in the search indexes, I know I've had customers say, the actual archiving speed itself is quite slow, and I think it's relevant to understand what the difference is with attachments indexing. Would you just want to mention a couple of points?
MailStore, by default, MailStore will always index the plain mails, so the header parts and of course the content when it's just plain text. And optionally, you can set up a MailStore server to index much more. For example, Office files, docx, and also Adobe PDF files, for example. You have a lot of options to actually add different file types that you can also index. But this, of course, means that indexing will take more time because there will be additional filters loaded and going through all these files that would be attached and actually fetching any kind of text to be indexed.
That's an important one, actually, isn't it? In fact, going back to what questions you ask in the beginning, you need to find out exactly what attachments they're using and what they expect to be indexed.
It's one that's come back to us in the past where, admins have turned it all on and then wondered why, importing terabytes of email is taking days, and you think, well, actually, is that absolutely needed in this scenario? If you don't need that function, then it can make a big difference how quickly you can archive a large amount of old email.
That's a good point. I can see Bruno from our Italian friends over at ACAB, I believe, just saying thanks for the session, and he was just saying, at which point do you need to start thinking about using SQL over the embedded Firebird database, if at all?
Actually, MailStore Server is, as we already bring our database technology embedded with the MailStore Server, you don't need any external database solution. And because we know that we deliver it this way, we can, of course, optimize MailStore Server in the best way that it works most performant with it. So basically, using an external Microsoft SQL server or a PostgreSQL server is possible. We offer the option, but actually it will not give you any advantage in terms of speed or performance. It will not make that much of a difference. It is rather interesting when you have already have a data center and you have a backup strategy and you want to keep up with your Microsoft SQL server, for example, where you already have all this strategy set up. Then of course the archive stores can also be in such an SQL server, but it will not be a performance boost as such.
Excellent.
So it's perfectly optimized on Firebird database. It already brings with it.
Yeah, so no real advantages as such. It's not a requirement. It's just whether it suits your kind of your infrastructure, your setup. Damien mentioned he's run into some performance issues with SPE and says that journaling has helped significantly with the issue. However, client admins are able to make changes that affect processor threads.
Okay.
I guess the argument there is because, you know, with SPE you've got shared servers. If you then give your customers admin rights, they can create their own jobs, so that potentially you've got less control over what jobs are running at the same time. I mean, unfortunately, this, you know, by definition, that's something that you know, you've really got to keep an eye on as the overlooking admin, or sort of correct term there. And sharing those resources. I mean, SPE does give you that ability to move different instances onto different hardware as needed. But yes, indeed, you know, that you can't ring fence the performance. The instance will effectively be able to use the resources of the physical hardware it's on if it's set up incorrectly. So that does need to be carefully monitored.
Yes, you got to see it this way. What I just showed a while ago about how to not run too many things in automatic mode and how to manage jobs not to run too many things at the same time. This is one MailStore server, and the SPE can host multiple instances that are kind of like MailStore server. So there's multiple MailStore servers, kind of multiple MailStore servers on a machine. And each one is administrated by somebody, by another person, and they all do this. And when they're all configuring in the rather ineffective way with a lot of tasks, it can, of course, this problem can sum up to a big problem when actually they're all doing it not in the most effective way.
That's what Damien's mentioned, actually. He's saying it would be quite useful if you could somehow restrict that, because they're obviously not aware of what the underlying hardware is that's being used.
I don't think you can actually restrict, but one thing I know we've done in one SPE installation was we didn't give the customers full admin rights. The SPE, if they set up the jobs as the main SPE admin, then the only rights they give the customer are user rights, and where needed, user rights that can, have permissions across other archives. They never give them an admin user, so they never give them the ability to create any new archive jobs. It flips the role around, and it only suits an MSP that is prepared to manage the jobs. But it does give you that control where, you know, you can have a customer who uses MailStore but isn't actively able to change the jobs.
And another trick would be to actually, it's of course a licensing issue, but let's say you have like, I think it's with Microsoft Server Data Center versions, for example, when you have a hypervisor, you can create as many machines you want on the same hypervisor, and this is fully okay with the license. I think it's Microsoft licensing. I cannot get too deep into that, but then you actually the SPE allows you to create as many instance hosts as you want. So you can actually put up a new machine with a new instance host, register it to the SPE, and just put this one customer instance on this machine. And then the customer can just mess up the machine completely until it's completely overloaded, but this won't affect the other instances which are on other machines, for example. This could also be a very interesting trick, just assigning some resources to this machine and give the customer the full machine, kind of, because there's no other instances on it.
Damien's actually mentioned the point I was going to make there as well, which is if you do that in a cloud-hosted provider like Azure or AWS, and you think of your SPE instances as individual servers, so rather than having one with lots of customers on, you have lots of smaller instances, then each instance does have its own ring-fenced set of performances. So you can do it that way as well. It's a little bit more work to manage, but at least then you're absolutely clear on, you know, what performance you give a specific customer.
Very good. Okay, so I think that's it for questions, unless anyone else has got any. Damien mentioned that. Damien mentioned that could be quite expensive, but it's as with all of these topics. Of course, there are so many different scenarios, and we were talking about the service provider edition there of MailStore, not the server. So it's the one for MSPs, service providers who want to host their own. So there's lots of different scenarios, and different scenarios within the different product sets as well. So the best thing to do, if you've got questions or you want us to address a particular scenario, then by all means just give us a call, either MailStore or the distribution partner that you work with. But if there are any, I'll hang on just for a moment in case there's any more questions, and if not, I'll draw the session to a close. Thanks very much for that. That's been informative and educational for me, as always, when it's these technical topics. Okay. Well, just while we're waiting anyway, I'll just let you know the next session should be a really good one. So I've got, funnily enough, one of our long-term SPEs are going to join us. So Luke and his team from LMS Group in a couple of weeks are going to be joining us for basically an informal chat about what they do. They've got a really substantial SPE installation. They're a Microsoft Gold partner, and they do some really interesting things, both in the way that they sell it and the way that they set it up with the different infrastructure. They've been through the journey of starting it on a small server, and it's grown. So hopefully that'll be a really interesting chat, and I'm looking forward to it because it'll be more customers talking than me talking, which is great. So yeah, hopefully it'll be useful for you guys and be one you can enjoy. So keep that in mind. There'll be a registration form out shortly. If you want to just put your name down for it now, I'll be honest, I haven't got the registration form sorted just yet, but you can just email partners@mailstore.com, and we'll I can add you to the list by all means. Make sure you get an invite, but we will inform you guys in the normal way. Right, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in, so I think all that's left is to say thank you very much for you guys for joining me. Really appreciate you helping me out with that one. And
no problem. Well.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
No worries. All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you everyone for sticking with us and for the extended session that this has been and a couple of technical glitches. And yeah, we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. All right, all the best. Thanks.
Cheers.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.